The bullet that ended Tom Sutton's life left him just enough breath to name the wrong man. And that single dying mistake nearly hanged an innocent rancher before the truth rode in on a stranger's horse. The evening was the color of a bruise when Tom's paint gelding came thundering down the road toward the Sutton Ranch house. Its rider slumped so far forward in the saddle that Kate Sutton, standing on the porch shaking out a rag rug, thought at first her brother had simply fallen asleep in the stirrups after a long day working the herd. It was only when the horse skidded to a stop in front of the porch steps and Tom slid sideways, boots catching in the stirrups, that she understood something was terribly wrong. Tom! She dropped the rug and ran, her skirts catching against the porch rail, and by the time she reached him he had already hit the dust, one hand pressed to his side where his shirt had gone black and wet in the fading light. "Kate," he said, and his voice had a wet rattle in it that she would hear in her dreams for years afterward. "Kate, I got to tell you." "Don't talk, don't you dare talk, save your breath," she said, though even as she said it her hands were already tearing at his shirt, trying to see how bad it was, and she knew from the amount of blood soaking into the Wyoming dirt that there would be no saving him, not with the nearest doctor 2 hours away in Larkspur and her brother's life measured now in minutes instead of hours. "Crowley," Tom whispered. "It was Crowley's spurs, Kate. I seen them by the creek right before he shot me. Silver conchos, the ones with the eagle on them, everybody knows they're his. Jed Crowley shot you." She could hardly credit it. Jed Crowley was a hard man, stubborn as a Missouri mule about the water rights along Willow Creek, and he and Tom had exchanged more than a few sharp words over fence lines and grazing ground, but she had never imagined it could come to this. "The spurs," Tom said again, and his eyes were losing their focus now, sliding toward the darkening sky. "But Kate, listen. The bank. Watch the—" He never finished the sentence. His hand, which had been gripping hers hard enough to bruise, went slack, and Tom Sutton, 26 years old, the only family Kate Sutton had left in the world, died in the dirt outside the house their father had built with his own 2 hands 11 years before. Kate did not remember screaming, though the hired hand, old Ezra Prout, later said he heard her clear across the north pasture. She did not remember riding into Larkspur bareback on Tom's own gelding, her brother's blood still drying on her hands and dress. She remembered only fragments after that, the sheriff's face gone gray and grim in the lamplight of his office, the words Jed Crowley passing from mouth to mouth through the saloon and the mercantile and the little Methodist church, until by midnight half the town of Larkspur was strapping on gun belts and saddling horses for a posse. It was in the chaos of that gathering, men shouting over each other in the sheriff's office and out in the street, lanterns swinging, horses stamping and blowing in the cold October air, that Kate first laid eyes on Phineas Atkins. He was not shouting. That was the first thing she noticed about him, in the small, strange corner of her mind that could still notice things even through her grief. While Sheriff Wyatt Doyle tried to organize a dozen angry, half-drunk ranch hands into something resembling a lawful posse, Phineas Atkins stood quietly near the hitching post, checking the cinch on a rangy bay gelding, his hat pulled low, his gray eyes moving over the crowd with a careful, measuring look that seemed entirely out of place among the shouting. "You're the new deputy," Kate said, because someone had to say something to cut through the roar in her own head, and this stranger's calm was the only still point in the room. "Phineas Atkins, ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat. He could not have been more than 29 or 30, lean and sun-browned, with the kind of quiet watchfulness that men who had ridden with the Texas Rangers sometimes carried with them long after they had put away the badge. "Sheriff Doyle took me on this past spring. I am sorry for your brother. I am told he was a fine man." "He was the finest," Kate said, and her voice cracked on the word, and to her own great embarrassment she began to cry right there in the street, in front of a stranger in half the town. Phineas did not try to embrace her, which she was grateful for, not being a woman who welcomed the touch of men she did not know, no matter how kindly meant. Instead, he simply stood beside her, solid as a fence post, and said nothing at all until her tears had run their course, and then he offered her a clean handkerchief from his coat pocket. "Sheriff means to ride out to the Crowley place tonight," he said. "Your brother named him with his own mouth. That is enough for the law to act on, but it is not enough to my mind to be certain." "What do you mean, not enough?" Kate wiped her eyes and looked at him properly for the first time. "He said it was Crowley's spurs. He saw them plain." "I do not doubt what your brother saw," Phineas said carefully. "I only wonder what it means." "A man dying does not always say the whole of what is in his head, ma'am. Sometimes the last words are only the beginning of a thought, and the ending of it goes down into the grave with him." Kate thought of Tom's hand going slack in hers, of the way his voice had trailed off just as he started to say the bank, watched and something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the October wind. "He was trying to tell me something else," she said slowly. "About the bank. He never got to finish it." Phineas's gray eyes sharpened with sudden interest. "What bank?" "Ours, I suppose. Larkspur Trust, Mr. Marrow's bank. Tom went in there last week to talk about a loan on the north section, I believe, though he never told me the particulars." She shook her head, trying to force her grief-fogged mind to work properly. "He has been strange lately, worried about something, but he would not say what." Before Phineas could ask anything further, Sheriff Doyle's voice cut across the street, calling the posse to mount up, and the moment was swallowed by the general clatter of boots and stirrups and creaking saddle leather. Kate found herself pulled toward her own borrowed horse by Ezra Prout, who had followed her into town, insisting she should go home and rest, that this was men's business now, that a posse riding after a killer in the dark was no place for a grieving young woman. "He was my brother," Kate said, and there was iron in her voice now where before there had only been grief. "I am coming." Sheriff Doyle, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache stained yellow from tobacco, looked as though he wanted to argue the point, but something in Kate Sutton's face persuaded him otherwise, and in the end it was Phineas Atkins who spoke up on her behalf. "Let her ride with us, Sheriff. She has as much right as any man here, and more reason than most." Doyle grunted, clearly displeased, but he did not forbid it. And so it was that Kate Sutton rode out of Larkspur that night as part of the posse bound for the Crowley Ranch, with Phineas Atkins keeping his bay gelding close beside her borrowed mare the whole 8 miles, saying little, but somehow making the darkness feel less like a thing that might swallow her whole. The Crowley Ranch sat in a shallow valley folded between 2 low ridges, its house dark except for a single lit window when the posse came riding up with torches and lanterns bobbing in the night. Jed Crowley himself came out onto his porch in his nightshirt, a shotgun cradled in his arms, his gray hair wild from sleep, and for one terrible moment Kate thought there would be shooting before anyone had said a single word. "Crowley!" Sheriff Doyle called out, his voice pitched to carry over the stamping horses. "Tom Sutton is dead, shot through the side out by Willow Creek this evening. Before he died, he named you as the man who did it. Now you can put that gun down and come along peaceable, or you can make this harder than it needs to be." "I did not shoot Tom Sutton," Crowley said, and his voice, though it shook with anger and fear both, did not sound to Kate like the voice of a guilty man. "I have not laid eyes on Tom Sutton in better than a week. Ask anybody. I was in Cheyenne at the cattle auction until this very afternoon, and half the ranchers in this territory can tell you the same, because I was standing right beside them at the bidding." "That is easy enough to check," Phineas said quietly, before Doyle could respond, and there was something in his tone that made even the angriest men in the posse pause and listen. "If Mr. Crowley was in Cheyenne, there will be men who saw him there, and there will be a record of what he bought and sold. That is not the kind of thing a man can lie about easy, not with so many witnesses." Doyle scowled, clearly torn between his desire to see swift justice done and the plain good sense of what his young deputy was suggesting. "And what about the spurs, then? Tom Sutton named you by your own spurs, the silver ones with the eagle on the conchos. Everybody in this county knows those spurs, Crowley." You have worn them to every dance and social for the last 3 years. Crowley's face, in the flickering torchlight, went from anger to bewilderment. My spurs are in my tack room where they always are. I have not worn them since Sunday meeting a week gone, on account of I have been too busy readying stock for the auction to bother with dancing spurs. Then you will not object, Phineas said, if we take a look in your tack room to see if they are there or not. It was, Kate would think later, the turning point of everything, though at the time it felt only like one more strange, cold moment in the longest night of her life. Crowley, still gripping his shotgun but no longer pointing it at anyone in particular, led the way around the side of the house to a small tack shed, lit a lantern with hands that trembled with outrage rather than guilt, and threw open the door. The tack room was neat as a pin. Bridles and headstalls hung in their proper places, saddles racked along one wall, but where a pair of silver spurs with eagle-etched conchos should have hung on their customary peg by the door, there was only an empty hook. "They are gone," Crowley said, and now his bewilderment had turned to something like fear. "They were there Tuesday last, I would swear it on my mother's grave. Somebody has taken them." Doyle looked hard at Phineas, and Phineas looked back at him with that same calm, careful expression Kate had noticed in the sheriff's office. A man does not usually steal spurs and then leave them lying at the scene of a murder unless he means for somebody to be blamed for it, Phineas said. "Sheriff, I think before this posse hangs anybody from the nearest cottonwood, we owe it to Tom Sutton, and to justice both, to find out who had reason and opportunity to steal Mr. Crowley's spurs sometime this past week." There was a long, uneasy silence among the men gathered in the yard, torches sputtering, breath steaming in the cold night air. Kate felt something shift inside her own chest, a small, fragile hope taking root where before there had been only grief and the desire for swift vengeance. If Crowley had not done it, then somebody else had killed her brother and gone to considerable trouble to see that Crowley hanged for it instead. "We will send a man to Cheyenne in the morning to confirm the auction," Doyle said finally, though his voice was gruff with the reluctant admission that his deputy might be right. "In the meantime, Crowley, you will consider yourself under watch. I am not saying you are cleared, only that I am not of a mind to string a man up on a dead man's confused last words when there is a mystery about stolen spurs that wants explaining." Crowley, to his credit, did not argue with being watched, seeming almost relieved that anyone was willing to listen to reason at all. The posse rode back toward Larkspur in a chastened, quieter mood than they had ridden out in, and it was somewhere on that long ride home, with the stars wheeling overhead and the cold biting through her coat, that Kate found herself talking to Phineas Atkins in a way she had not talked to anyone since her parents died. "You believe someone is trying to make it look like Crowley did this," she said. "It was not really a question." "I think it is possible," Phineas said. "I have seen men frame each other before back in Texas. It is an ugly business, but it happens, especially where there is money or land at stake, and men grow desperate to have what is not rightfully theirs." "Tom was trying to tell me something about the bank," Kate said again, turning the fragment of memory over and over like a stone in her hand. "He never got to finish it. Watch the bank," he said. "What could that mean?" "I do not know yet," Phineas admitted, "but I mean to find out if you will allow me to help you look." Kate looked over at him in the moonlight, at the steady, honest lines of his face, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched tight since the moment Tom's horse came thundering up the road. "I would be glad of the help," she said. "I do not think I could bear to see an innocent man hanged for what happened to my brother on top of everything else." "Then we will find the truth of it together," Phineas said, "however long it takes." They rode the rest of the way back to Larkspur in a silence that was, for the first time that terrible night, something other than grief. The days that followed were strange, suspended days, full of the business of death, arrangements for Tom's burial, the reading of the small will he had left behind naming Kate as sole heir to the Sutton Ranch, and beneath all of it the slow, careful work of investigation that Phineas Atkins carried on with a patience Kate had never before seen in a man his age. The rider sent to Cheyenne returned within 3 days with sworn statements from no fewer than 6 ranchers, confirming that Jed Crowley had indeed been at the cattle auction the entire day of the murder, arriving the evening before and not departing until well after Tom Sutton had already been dead several hours, by the time anyone could have ridden back from Cheyenne to Willow Creek. Sheriff Doyle, grumbling but fair-minded, released Crowley from his watch and admitted publicly, in the Larkspur Gazette no less, that the earlier suspicion had been in error. That left the matter of who had actually killed Tom Sutton very much unsettled, and it was Kate herself, 3 days after the funeral, who found the first real thread to follow. She had gone out to Willow Creek at dawn, unable to sleep, drawn back to the place where her brother had been shot despite every instinct telling her to stay away. The morning was cold and gray, mist still clinging low over the water, and she found Phineas already there ahead of her, crouched low along the muddy bank, studying the ground with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "You are up early," she said, coming to stand beside him, her breath clouding in the chill air. "I could not stop thinking about this place," Phineas said, not looking up. "There is something here that does not sit right with me, and I mean to find out what it is before the rain washes away what is left of the sign. Sign. Tracks. Marks in the mud. A man leaves more of himself behind than he ever means to, Miss Sutton, especially in soft ground like this." He pointed to a set of boot prints pressed deep into the bank, half obscured now by 3 days of weather. "These are not Crowley's boots, nor your brother's neither, from what I recall of the size of his feet. These are smaller, narrower, a city man's boots or near enough to it. Cattlemen wear their heels different from riding all day. These heels are barely worn at all." Kate crouched down beside him, studying the faint impression in the mud, feeling a strange, fierce gladness that someone else in the world cared as much as she did about finding the truth. "Could you tell anything else? There is this." Phineas reached into his coat and produced a small object wrapped in a handkerchief, which he unfolded carefully to reveal a brass button, the kind used on a fine gentleman's waistcoat rather than a working man's shirt. "Found it caught in the willow scrub yonder, not 10 feet from where your brother must have fallen. It does not belong to any rancher I have met in this county, not with that kind of tailoring." "A banker's button," Kate breathed, and the cold feeling from that first night returned to her chest, sharp and certain now. "Tom said watch the bank. He was trying to warn me it had something to do with Mr. Merrow." "Perhaps," Phineas said, cautious as always. "Or perhaps someone who works for him or does business with him. We should not leap ahead of what the evidence tells us, Miss Sutton, tempting as it is. But I think it is past time we paid a visit to Larkspur Trust and asked Mr. Merrow a few plain questions about what business your brother had with him." They rode back into town together, and Kate found herself, not for the first time that week, deeply grateful for the steady, unhurried way Phineas Atkins approached even the most painful and frightening puzzle. There was something in his manner that reminded her of a man carefully working loose a splinter, patient and careful so as not to cause more hurt than necessary, and yet utterly determined to see the thing through to the end. She had known, in the 4 days since her brother's death, more grief than she had thought a body could hold, and yet in the company of this quiet stranger she found she could breathe a little easier, could think a little more clearly, as though his calm were a kind of lantern lighting a path through her own darkness. Silas Merrow received them in his office at Larkspur Trust with every appearance of sympathy and cooperation. A portly, silver-haired man of perhaps 50 years, dressed in a fine dark suit with a gold watch chain looped across his waistcoat. He rose from behind his heavy oak desk when they entered, offering his condolences to Kate with what seemed like genuine feeling, and invited them both to sit. "A terrible business," Merrow said, shaking his head. "Tom was a fine young man, a hard-working rancher, exactly the sort of man this territory needs more of, not less. I cannot tell you how it grieves me to hear what happened to him." "He came to see you last week, I believe," Phineas said, in that same easy, unhurried tone he seemed to use for every question, no matter how pointed. "About a loan, Miss Sutton tells me." "That is correct." Merrow spread his hands in a gesture of open helplessness. "Tom wished to borrow against the north section of his land to purchase additional breeding stock, I believe. Unfortunately, I was obliged to decline the loan. The bank's reserves have been stretched rather thin this year, what with the drought last summer, and I did not feel it prudent to extend further credit at this time." "That is a shame," Phineas said. "Did he seem upset by the refusal?" "Disappointed, certainly, but not unduly so. These things happen in business, Deputy. A man cannot always get the credit he hopes for." Kate, who had been sitting quietly, watching the banker's face with an intensity that surprised even herself, spoke up suddenly. "He said something to me before he died. He said, 'Watch the bank.' What do you suppose he meant by that, Mr. Merrow?" For just a moment, so brief that Kate might have imagined it entirely, something flickered behind Silas Merrow's eyes, gone almost before it appeared, replaced instantly by an expression of sorrowful bewilderment. "I could not begin to guess, Miss Sutton. Perhaps he was troubled by the loan refusal after all, more than he let on. Grief does strange things to memory, and dying men, I am told, often speak in riddles that made perfect sense to them and none at all to the rest of us." It was a smooth answer, delivered without hesitation, and yet Kate found herself unconvinced, though she could not have said precisely why. When they left the bank a few minutes later, having gained nothing more concrete than that single vanishing flicker of expression, she voiced her unease to Phineas as they stood together on the boardwalk outside. "He is lying about something," she said. "I felt it, though I could not tell you what." "I felt something too," Phineas admitted. "Though a feeling is not evidence, and we will need considerably more than a feeling before we can accuse a man like Silas Merrow of anything, especially a man with his standing in this town. We must be careful, Miss Sutton. If he is involved in your brother's death, and if he has already gone to the trouble of framing an innocent rancher to cover his tracks, he will not take kindly to being questioned, and he will not hesitate to protect himself by whatever means necessary." "Then what do we do?" Phineas considered a long moment before answering, his gray eyes narrowed against the afternoon sun. "We find out who owns those boots and who lost that button. And we look into what business dealings Silas Merrow has been engaged in of late, quietly, so as not to alert him that we suspect him of anything more than a poor choice of words." It was in the pursuit of that quiet inquiry that Kate and Phineas spent the better part of the following week together, and it was in that week, more than any other time before or since, that Kate Sutton found herself falling in love with a man she had known scarcely 10 days. They rode together to Cheyenne to examine county land records, discovering that Silas Merrow had, over the past 8 months, quietly purchased no fewer than 4 struggling ranches at prices well below their true worth, each purchase made through a shell company registered to a lawyer in Denver, each seller having been, according to gossip they gathered along the way, deeply in debt to Larkspur Trust at the time of sale. They learned, through careful and discreet conversation with the county surveyor, that the Union Pacific had commissioned a private survey of the valley the previous spring, a survey whose results had not yet been made public, but which, if the surveyor's hints were to be believed, showed that a branch line was likely to be built directly through the Willow Creek Valley within the next 2 years, a branch line that would make every acre of land along the creek worth 10 times its current value. "Tom's ranch sits square in the middle of that valley," Kate said, the pieces falling into place with a horrible, sickening clarity as they sat together over coffee in a small Cheyenne cafe, the autumn light slanting gold through the window. If Merrow knew about the railroad coming and Tom would not sell to him, or take a loan that would put the ranch in the bank's power, then he had reason to want your brother out of the way, Phineas finished quietly. And reason enough to frame Jed Crowley for it, since a hanged rancher can raise no objection when his neighbor's estate comes up for sale at whatever price the bank cares to name, especially once you, as a grieving young woman alone, might be persuaded to sell rather than fight to keep land that had already cost you your only brother. Kate set down her coffee cup with a hand that was not quite steady. He never intended to let me keep the ranch at all. He killed Tom to get it, and he would have found some way to press me into selling once Crowley hanged for the crime, and the whole business was closed and forgotten. I believe that may be exactly what he intended, Phineas said, and there was an anger in his voice now that Kate had not heard from him before, quiet still, but banked hot beneath the surface like a coal. But he underestimated you, Miss Sutton, and he underestimated your brother's dying words, which were wiser and more complete than even Tom himself perhaps realized. He named the frame, and he named the true villain both, in the same breath, though it took us some days to untangle which was which. It was there, in that small cafe in Cheyenne, with the last of the autumn light falling across the table between them, that Phineas Atkins reached across and took Kate's hand in his, not with any great declaration, but simply as a man offers comfort and solidarity to another who has suffered a grievous wrong. "I lost my own father to a lie much like this one," he said quietly, and Kate looked up startled, for he had never spoken of his own past before in all their days together. "Back in Texas, when I was 17 years old. A cattle baron wanted our family spread, and when my father refused to sell, cattle turned up missing from the baron's herd, driven onto our land in the night by men in the baron's pay, and my father was hanged for rustling before the truth ever came out, which it did, eventually, too late to save him. I became a lawman because of that, Miss Sutton. I could not save my own father from a false accusation, but I have sworn to myself, every day since, that I would do everything in my power to see that no other family suffers as mine did, if I can help it." Kate felt tears sting her eyes, not only for her own brother now, but for this quiet, careful man beside her, who had carried such grief for so many years and turned it, somehow, into a fierce and steady devotion to justice rather than bitterness. "I am so sorry," she said. "That is a terrible thing for a boy to bear." "It made me who I am," Phineas said simply. "And I think, perhaps, it is part of why I could not simply let this posse hang Jed Crowley on your brother's confused last words, however understandable the mistake might have been. I have seen what comes of hanging the wrong man, Miss Sutton. I will not stand by and let it happen again while I have breath in my body to prevent it." "Kate," she said softly, "please call me Kate. I think after everything we are well past the point of such formality between us." "Kate," Phineas said, and something in the way he said her name, gentle and a little wondering, made her heart turn over in her chest. "Then you must call me Phineas." They rode back toward Larkspur that evening in a silence that was warm rather than grieving, their hands brushing occasionally as their horses walked side by side. And though neither of them spoke of love in so many words, Kate understood, somewhere deep in her chest, that whatever else came of this terrible business, she had found in Phineas Atkins a partner for whatever remained of her life, if he would have her. But there was still the matter of proving what they now believed to be true, and proof, as Phineas had warned her from the start, was a far harder thing to come by than suspicion. It was Ezra Prout, the old hired hand who had worked the Sutton ranch since before Kate was born, who provided the next piece of the puzzle, though he did not know it at the time. 2 weeks after the funeral, as Kate and Phineas sat at the kitchen table poring over the land records they had gathered, Ezra came in from the barn with a curious look on his weathered face. "There is a stranger been sniffing around the north pasture the last few days," Ezra said, settling his old bones into a chair. "I seen him twice now, riding a lathered black horse, always keeping his distance, never coming close enough to hail. City fellow by the look of his rig, though he sits a horse well enough for all that." "Did you get a look at his face?" Phineas asked, sitting up sharply. "Not close, no, but he wears a flat-crowned black hat, unusual style for these parts, and he has a way of riding hunched down low over the withers that I have seen before, though I cannot place where." Kate exchanged a glance with Phineas. "You think it is the man who killed Tom, come back to see if there is more mischief to be done?" "I think," Phineas said slowly, "that if Merrill hired a man to do his killing for him, that man may still be in the area, waiting for further orders, or perhaps growing nervous now that Crowley has been cleared and suspicion has nowhere solid to land. A hired killer left dangling like that, with no one to blame but himself if the truth comes out, might be a man worth finding before Merrill decides to silence him for good." They kept watch after that, Ezra taking the north pasture during daylight hours while Phineas, with Sheriff Doyle's blessing, arranged to have a deputy from the neighboring county quietly watch the roads leading toward Larkspur from Cheyenne, in case the stranger tried to make a run for the railhead. It was 4 days later, on a cold, clear morning with frost silvering the grass, that the stranger showed himself again, riding the same lathered black horse along the tree line at the edge of the Sutton property, and this time Phineas was ready. He and Kate had been out checking the herd together, a task Kate had insisted on continuing despite her grief, unwilling to let the ranch fall into neglect while the investigation dragged on, and it was Kate who spotted the black horse first, off among the cottonwoods along the creek. "There," she said softly, catching Phineas's sleeve. "That must be the man Ezra saw." Phineas followed her gaze, and his hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip, though he did not draw it. "Stay behind me," he said, "and if there is trouble, ride for the house as fast as that mare will carry you. Do you understand me, Kate?" "I understand," Kate said, though she had no intention whatsoever of abandoning him if trouble came, a fact Phineas would later tell her he had suspected even as he gave the instruction. They rode toward the tree line at an easy walk, not wanting to spook the stranger into flight before they could get close enough to speak with him. But the man on the black horse had already noticed them, and after a moment of clear hesitation, he wheeled his mount and spurred hard for the open country beyond the creek. "Stop," Phineas called out, urging his bay into a gallop. "I am a deputy of this county, and I mean to have words with you." The stranger did not stop. He drove his lathered black horse across the shallow creek at a reckless pace, nearly losing his seat as the animal stumbled on the rocky bottom, and it was that stumble, more than anything Phineas or Kate did, that brought the chase to its end. The black horse went down hard on the far bank, throwing its rider clear into a stand of willow scrub, and by the time Phineas reached him, the man was on his back, groaning, one leg twisted awkwardly beneath him, clearly unable to run any further. He was younger than Kate had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with a thin, hard face and pale eyes that darted between Phineas and Kate with the desperate calculation of a cornered animal. "I have done nothing," the man said, though his voice shook with more than pain. "You have no right to chase a man down like a dog." "What is your name?" Phineas asked, crouching beside him but keeping a careful distance, his revolver drawn now though not aimed directly at the injured man. "Dutch Rays," the man said after a long, sullen pause, "and I am telling you I have done nothing." "Then why did you run?" Kate asked, dismounting and coming to stand a little behind Phineas, close enough to see the man's face clearly. Dutch Rays's pale eyes flicked to her, and something in his expression, a flash of recognition mixed with guilt, told Kate more clearly than any words could have that this man knew exactly who she was, and exactly why she had reason to hate him. "You are the Sutton girl," Dutch Rays said quietly. "Tom Sutton's sister." "I am," Kate said, her voice steady though her heart was pounding fit to burst from her chest. "And I think you know something about how my brother died." "I think you know a great deal more than nothing, Mr. Rays." For a long moment, Dutch Rays said nothing at all, his jaw working as though he were chewing over some private, bitter calculation. Then slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto one elbow, wincing at the movement of his injured leg, and looked directly at Phineas. "If I tell you what I know," he said, "will you see that I am not the one who hangs for this? I only did what I was paid to do. I did not want the girl's brother dead. It was not my idea, none of it." "I cannot promise you will escape punishment entirely," Phineas said, and Kate admired him for his honesty even in that fraught moment, for he did not lie to the man to gain a swifter confession. But I can promise you that a jury looks more kindly on a man who tells the truth and helps set right a terrible wrong than on one who stays silent and lets an innocent man hang in his place. You have a choice before you, Mr. Reyes. Make it wisely." Dutch Reyes closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, something in his hard face had shifted, as though a great weight had finally been set down after being carried too long. "Silas Marrow paid me $200 to kill Tom Sutton," he said. "He gave me Crowley's spurs, told me to leave them near the body, said Crowley had a grudge with Sutton that everybody in the county knew about, and that the blame would fall on him easy enough. I did not want to do it, but I owed Marrow money from a bad land deal 2 years back, and he told me the debt would be forgiven if I did this one thing for him. God help me, I did it." Kate felt the world tilt strangely around her, grief and vindication and horror all crashing together at once, and it was Phineas's steady hand on her shoulder that kept her upright in that moment. "Where did you shoot him?" Phineas asked, his voice hard now in a way Kate had not heard before. "Tell it all, Reyes, every detail, so there can be no mistake about what happened." "By Willow Creek, like the sheriff already knows," Dutch Reyes said. "He came riding along the creek path at dusk, same as he did most evenings, checking his fence lines, and I was waiting in the willow scrub where Marrow told me he would pass. I shot him once from cover, and I meant to make sure of the job, but he did not go down easy, and by the time I reached him he had already spurred that horse of his into a run, bleeding but alive, and I could not catch him before he was gone toward the house. I dropped the spurs where he would be found like I was told, and I rode for Cheyenne that same night, meaning to disappear for good, but Marrow sent word after me that I was to stay close in case there was more work needed, on account of the girl and the deputy asking too many questions. "He meant for you to kill us as well," Kate said, the horror of it settling cold in her stomach. "He did not say that outright," Dutch Reyes admitted, "but I do not think he would have stopped short of it, not with as much as he stands to gain from that valley once the railroad comes through. He has been buying up half the ranches along Willow Creek for months now, ma'am, and yours was the last piece he needed to control the whole stretch where the rail line is like to run." Phineas straightened, his face set in hard, grim lines. "We will need you to say all of this again in front of Sheriff Doyle and a judge if it comes to trial. Will you do that, Mr. Reyes?" Dutch Reyes let out a long, ragged breath, and something like relief passed over his hard features. "I will. God knows I have carried this long enough. I never wanted to kill any man, deputy. I was desperate, and Marrow knew it, and he used that desperation same as he uses every other man's weakness in this county to get what he wants. I will tell it all, if it means an innocent man does not hang for what I did." They brought Dutch Reyes back to Larkspur that same afternoon, his leg splinted as best they could manage, and delivered him into Sheriff Doyle's custody, where his confession was taken down in full by the town clerk and witnessed by no fewer than 3 respectable citizens, including the Methodist minister, to ensure there could be no question later of its validity. Sheriff Doyle, upon hearing the confession, went pale beneath his gray mustache. "Silas Marrow," he said, shaking his head slowly. "I have known that man 12 years, sat on the town council with him, never would have suspected it, not in 1,000 years. That is precisely why he thought he could get away with it," Phineas said. "A man of his standing does not expect to be questioned, Sheriff. That is the great danger of trusting a man simply because he wears a fine suit and sits behind a big desk." "We will need to move quickly," Doyle said, gathering himself. "If word reaches him that Reyes has been caught, he will run, or worse, he may try to silence Miss Sutton here, seeing as she is the one with the strongest claim against him." It was decided that Phineas, along with Sheriff Doyle and 2 trusted deputies, would ride to Larkspur Trust immediately to arrest Silas Marrow before he could be warned, while Kate, over her own strong objections, would remain at the sheriff's office under guard until the matter was settled. "I want to be there," Kate said fiercely, as Phineas checked his revolver one last time before mounting up. "He killed my brother, Phineas. I have as much right as anyone to see him answer for it." "I know you do," Phineas said, and he took her face gently in both his hands, an intimacy that surprised them both after everything that had passed between them in so short a time, though it felt in that moment entirely natural. "But Marrow is a desperate man now, and desperate men do desperate things. I could not bear it, Kate, if anything happened to you when I might have prevented it. Let me do this one thing, and I promise you, you will be there for whatever comes after, every step of it." Kate looked into his gray eyes, saw the fear there that had nothing to do with Sela's Marrow and everything to do with losing her, and something in her chest ached with a tenderness so fierce it nearly took her breath away. "Come back to me," she said softly. "Whatever happens in there, Phineas Atkins, you come back to me safe." "I will," Phineas said, and he pressed a brief, warm kiss to her forehead before swinging up into the saddle, and Kate stood watching until the small posse of lawmen had disappeared down the street toward the bank, her heart in her throat the entire time. What happened at Larkspur Trust that afternoon became, within days, the stuff of legend told and retold in every saloon and parlor in the county. Sheriff Doyle and Phineas Atkins entered the bank at 2:30 in the afternoon, finding Sela's Marrow at his desk as usual, and it was Phineas who spoke first, laying out the confession of Dutch Ray's in plain, unhurried terms, while Marrow's face went from confusion to disbelief to a kind of cold, calculating fear. "This is preposterous," Marrow said, rising from his chair. "You would take the word of a common criminal, a hired gun, over that of a respected member of this community. I have built this bank from nothing, Sheriff. I have served on the town council for a decade. This is an outrage." "The outrage," Phineas said, his voice hard and level, "is a young rancher lying dead by Willow Creek, and an innocent man very nearly hanged for a crime you paid to have committed against him. Also, you could steal his land out from under his grieving sister for a fraction of what you knew it would soon be worth. We have the land records, Mr. Marrow. We have the county surveyor's report on the railroad line. We have Dutch Ray's full confession, witnessed by 3 men of good standing in this town. And we will find, I expect, if we look hard enough at your books, considerably more evidence of exactly how you have been building your fortune these past months." It was at that point, according to the account Sheriff Doyle gave afterward, that Sela's Marrow made his final, desperate mistake. He lunged for a drawer in his desk, where a small pistol lay concealed beneath a stack of ledgers, and it was only Phineas Atkins's quick reflexes, honed by years of ranger service, that prevented the situation from turning to tragedy. Phineas caught Marrow's wrist before the drawer was even fully open, wrenching the pistol away and pinning the older man's arm hard against the desk, while Sheriff Doyle moved in with iron manacles to complete the arrest. "You would have been wiser to let the law take its course," Phineas said, breathing hard but entirely in control of himself, as Marrow struggled uselessly in his grip. "Now you have added attempted violence against an officer of the law to everything else you must answer for." Sela's Marrow, defeated at last, sagged in the chair where Doyle had forced him down, all his fine bearing crumbled away to reveal nothing more than a frightened, greedy old man who had let his ambitions carry him to murder. "The railroad," he said, his voice bitter and broken. "You do not understand what that line means, what it is worth. I only wanted what any man would want: security, wealth, a legacy to leave behind. Tom Sutton was going to sell to someone eventually." "Why should it not have been me?" "Because you did not ask him to sell," Phineas said. "You had him murdered when he refused, and you framed an innocent man for the crime, and you would have let that innocent man hang, while you comforted his sister with false sympathy, and waited for the chance to press her into selling as well. There is no amount of railroad money in the world that justifies what you have done, Mr. Marrow, and I expect the courts of this territory will agree with me on that point." They rode back to the sheriff's office with Sela's Marrow in irons between them, and when Kate saw Phineas dismount, whole and unharmed, she ran to him across the street without a single thought for propriety, and he caught her in his arms and held her there for a long, wordless moment while the town of Larkspur watched, and not a single person watching thought it anything but exactly as it should be. "It is done," Phineas murmured into her hair. "It is finished, Kate. Marrow will answer for what he did to your brother, and Jed Crowley's name has been fully cleared, and you need never fear for the ranch again." Kate pulled back just far enough to look up into his face, tears streaming freely now, though these were tears of a different kind than the grief that had consumed her these past weeks. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for believing me from that very first night, when it would have been so much easier simply to let the posse have its way." "I could not have done otherwise," Phineas said softly. "Not once I had met you, Kate Sutton. Not once I understood what kind of woman you were, fighting so hard for justice, even in the depths of your own grief. I think I began falling in love with you that very first night, standing in the street outside the sheriff's office, though I did not have the words for it then." "And do you have the words for it now?" Kate asked, her heart hammering so hard she thought surely he must be able to feel it even through the layers of coat and dress between them. "I love you," Phineas said simply, gray eyes steady on hers in the fading afternoon light. "I love you, Kate Sutton, and I do not intend to let this business end simply with the arrest of a murderer. I intend, if you will have me, to spend the whole of my life proving that love to you, every single day, for as long as we both shall live." Kate laughed then, a bright, startled sound amid all the lingering sorrow of the past weeks, and it felt like the first true laughter she had allowed herself since Tom's death. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have loved you since that first ride out to the Crowley ranch, though I was too full of grief to know what I was feeling at the time. Yes, Phineas Atkins. Yes, I will have you if you are asking what I think you are asking." "I am asking," Phineas said, and right there in the street, in front of Sheriff Doyle and half the population of Larkspur, he kissed her properly for the first time, and the small crowd that had gathered to watch the outcome of the day's dramatic events broke into applause and cheering that echoed off the false-fronted buildings all up and down the main street. The trial of Silas Marrow took place 3 weeks later in the county courthouse in Cheyenne, and it did not take the jury long to reach their verdict, given the weight of evidence assembled against him: the confession of Dutch Rays, the land records showing his pattern of predatory purchases, the county surveyor's testimony regarding the railroad survey, and the brass button and boot prints that Phineas had so carefully preserved from that first cold morning at Willow Creek. Silas Marrow was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang, a sentence that was carried out the following spring, and though Kate felt no particular satisfaction in the man's death, she felt, at last, a profound and settled peace, knowing that Tom's dying words had been fully understood at last, and that justice, however long delayed, had finally been done. Dutch Rays, in consideration of his full cooperation and confession, received a sentence of 15 years in the territorial prison rather than the noose, a mercy that Kate herself had spoken in favor of before the judge, arguing that a desperate man led into crime by debt, and coercion deserved a different measure of justice than the wealthy, calculating villain who had orchestrated the whole affair for his own profit. It was, Phineas told her afterward, a mercy that spoke well of her character, and one that he suspected her brother, wherever his spirit now rested, would have approved of as well. Jed Crowley, fully exonerated and deeply grateful to both Kate and Phineas for their persistence in uncovering the truth, became in time not merely a cleared suspect, but a genuine friend to the Sutton family. And it was Crowley himself who insisted on helping repair the Sutton ranch's fences and outbuildings that winter, a gesture of neighborly goodwill that went a long way toward healing whatever lingering bitterness might have remained between the two families after the terrible events of that autumn. As for Kate and Phineas, their courtship, born as it was in the fires of grief and injustice, proved in the months that followed to be built on a foundation far sturdier than mere romantic sentiment. They were wed the following spring, in the small Methodist church in Larkspur where Kate had been baptized as a child, with Sheriff Doyle standing as witness for the groom and old Ezra Prout giving the bride away in place of the brother who could not be there to do it himself. Though Kate felt certain in her heart that Tom's blessing rested over the whole proceeding. Phineas resigned his position as deputy the following autumn, at Kate's gentle urging, and together they worked the Sutton Ranch, which Phineas insisted on renaming the Sutton Atkins spread, refusing to let the Sutton name be lost simply because he had joined the family, a gesture that touched Kate more deeply than any grand romantic speech could have done. Under their combined care, the ranch prospered as it never had before, for Phineas brought to the work the same careful, patient attention he had once brought to unraveling a murder, and Kate brought the fierce, loving determination that had first drawn him to her on that terrible night when her whole world had come crashing down around her. The railroad did come through the valley eventually, just as Silas Marrow had foreseen, though by the time the survey crews arrived with their stakes and their measuring chains, it was Kate and Phineas Atkins who negotiated the sale of a narrow right-of-way strip across the northern edge of their land, at a fair price honestly earned, and the money from that sale went toward expanding the herd and building a fine new barn that still stands, weathered but sturdy, on that same stretch of Wyoming ground to this day. Their first child, a son, was born some 14 months after their wedding, in the same bedroom where Kate herself had been born, and they named him Thomas Ezra Atkins, in honor of both the brother who had been lost and the old hired hand who had been like a second father to Kate through all her years of hardship. Ezra Prout, upon hearing the boy's name, wept openly for the first time that anyone in Larkspur had ever witnessed, and declared that he intended to live to be 100 years old, if only to see young Thomas grown to manhood and riding the range as fine a cowboy as his uncle had ever been. A daughter followed 2 years after that, whom they named Grace, for the mercy that had finally settled over their lives after so much sorrow, and then a second son, whom Phineas insisted on naming Wyatt, after Sheriff Doyle, who had shown such fairness and courage in the face of a crime that had shaken the whole town's faith in the men it had trusted most. Sheriff Doyle, gruff as ever but plainly moved by the honor, took to visiting the ranch every Sunday afternoon thereafter, teaching young Wyatt to whittle and telling him stories of the old days, until the boy came to think of the old sheriff as something very near to a grandfather. Kate never forgot her brother, of course, nor would she have wished to, and every year on the anniversary of his death, she and Phineas would ride out together to the small family plot on a rise above the ranch house, where Tom Sutton lay buried beside their parents, and they would sit together in the quiet Wyoming air, remembering him, honoring the memory of a good man whose dying words, confused and fragmentary as they had been, had nonetheless carried within them the seed of truth that ultimately brought his killer to justice and spared an innocent neighbor from the hangman's rope. "He would have liked you," Kate told Phineas once, sitting beside that grave with their first child asleep in her arms, still an infant then, wrapped warm against the autumn chill. "Tom always said he wanted a man for me who would stand up for what was right, even when it was hard, even when everyone around him wanted to take the easy path instead." "I hope I have done him justice then," Phineas said quietly, looking out over the valley that had once nearly cost them everything, and which now stretched green and prosperous beneath a wide Wyoming sky. "I hope I have proven worthy of the trust his dying words placed in us, even though he never lived to see how that trust would be repaid." "You have," Kate said, resting her head against his shoulder as the sun began its slow descent toward the western ridge. "You have proven worthy of it every single day since, my love, and you will go on proving it, I think, for the whole of our lives together." And so it was that a cowboy's dying words, garbled and incomplete though they had been in that terrible moment beside Willow Creek, ultimately led not only to the unmasking of his true killer and the exoneration of an innocent man, but also to the joining of two hearts that might never otherwise have found each other, forging out of tragedy and injustice a love story that the people of Larkspur would tell and retell for generations. Long after the graves of everyone involved had settled quietly into the Wyoming earth, a testament to the enduring truth that even in the darkest hour, when grief and suspicion threaten to overwhelm all reason, patience, honesty, and courage can still uncover the light of justice, and love against every terrible odd can still find its way home. The ranch house that Tom Sutton's father had built with his own two hands still stands today, expanded now with a second story that Phineas added the year their fourth child was born, weathered gray by decades of Wyoming wind and sun, but sturdy still, a home filled with the laughter of children and grandchildren, a lasting monument to two people who had found, in the wreckage of one man's greed and violence, a partnership strong enough to carry them through the whole rest of their lives, together, in love, and finally fully at peace.